Hey guys, welcome to Learn Python the Hard Way. Today we're going to focus on exercise 17. And as always, you can find the link to the current exercise in the description below. Since this is part of the paid section of the book, you would actually need to purchase the book to follow along. Alternatively, just feel free to follow along with this video. So in the previous exercise, we took a look at working with files, how to open files and how to write files. And in this exercise, we will build on top of that. So what we're going to do here is we're going to write a Python script to copy one file to another. And again, we're going to use argv to provide some command line arguments. So let's get started with defining a new Python file and then typing in the exercise code. So again, we're going to open the terminal and navigate to the appropriate folder. And from here, we can then open a new Python file using, for example, Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to type in code and then the name of the file that we want to create. So exercise 17.py for Python. And as soon as we confirm, we basically create a new Python file, a new text file. And from here, let's get started by actually importing argv from the sys library. Next, we're going to import exists, which is going to help us to define or to figure out if a file actually exists from the OSPath module. After that, when we run the program itself, we're going to provide some command line arguments, 3 in total: the script name, the file that we want to copy from, and the file that we want to copy to, and those are stored in these 3 different variables. Let's next print out some string using printf, and we're going to communicate that we are copying a file from the from file over to the new file that we are creating. After that, we are going to define a new variable called infile, and we are going to open a new file here by opening the from file, and then we're going to define a new variable called indata, and we are reading from that in file that we just defined. After that, we're going to use printf again to print out what actually the length of indata is in bytes, and we're using the length function, the len function, to actually do that. After that, let's take printf again, and now for the first time we're going to use exists, which we imported from the OSPath library before. And we're going to print out if the output file actually exists by calling exists and passing it to file, so the file that we want to create. Next, print hit return to continue, or Control C, of course, to abort, which we would then execute from our command line. And then we're calling input to actually collect some input from a user. And after that, we can define a new variable called outFile. And here we're going to open toFile in write mode, so we can make some changes to it. And then we can write indata to outFile. And finally, let's print or write all done. And we have to close the out file and also the in file. Alright, so that's basically the exercise code here. And yeah, we imported exists here, another handy command that we can use from the OSPath module here. And that returns true if a file exists, based on the name in a string as an argument that we passed in here. and it returns false if the file does not exist. And in general, we can use import to get a lot of pre-written code, libraries that we want to import and want to work with, so we don't have to rewrite it ourselves. So to actually execute our code, let's head over to the terminal again. And from here, let's first of all create a new text file, and we're going to use echo to do that. So if we type out echo and then in quotation mark, for example, this is a test file, we can then decide where we want to basically store that text. So in this case, we're going to pass it to test.txt, a file which does not yet exist. As soon as I press enter, this is going to create a new file called test.txt, and within that text file, we're going to find the text. This is a test file. So echo can be really helpful if we work with a terminal and we want to basically print out some text, or we also want to store it, save it to a certain text file. So let's run cat.test.txt to actually print out the content. So here we can see indeed the content of the file test.txt is a test file. And also if we take a look at that, for example, here in Visual Studio Code by just running code and then followed by the name of the text file, that again is going to open basically the same content, and here we can see the text is indeed, this is a test file. So once we created that test.txt file with the text, we can now run our script. So here we're going to call Python 3.6 or Python 3, and then we pass those three variables to it, the three command line arguments. So first of all, the name of the script, which is exercise17.py, and then we pass in test.txt, the file which we just created, and of course the new file we want to create. So new file.txt. So once we press enter here, it shows us a bunch of lines. So here it tells us that the input file is 21 bytes long. It also says that the output file exists. And, oh, excuse me, the output file does not yet exist because we didn't create it yet. And to actually create that output file, we can press return to continue. So let's do that. And then at the end here, of course, it says, all right, all done. And now we basically should have created a new output file. So if we take a look again and we type out cat and then followed by new file.txt, the new file that we created, and we press enter, then we can see we indeed created a new text file with the same content of our test.txt file. So that's a bunch of code that, well, it requires a lot of lines of code that are unnecessary, but it helps us to basically copy the content from one text file over to a new one and basically to create a new text file. And we can do that with any file. So instead of calling it new file.txt, we could, for example, create another text file called, let's say, for example, another test. And again, we can confirm this. And now if we take a look at another test, again, we created a text file and it's printed out here. And again, we used echo to create a new file, and we used cat to show a new file. So these are very handy commands that we can execute on the terminal to either create a new file or to print out the content of a file. So let's take a look now at the study drills after we finish basically typing out the exercise. So the first study drill is to actually take a look at the script. And since it prints out too much to the screen, we should try to make it more friendly by removing some features. So one thing that's quite annoying is that it prints out a lot of text that we don't really need. So for example, all right, all done, we don't really need that. We can just remove that. We can also remove the input because when we execute the command, basically all we can do is basically to confirm it. And so we don't really need that. We can just remove that. We also can remove the print statement here. And also the fact that it exists or not, that's probably not relevant. So we could remove that as well. So we shortened it by quite a bit. And also this information that we are copying it from one file to another, we likely also don't need that. So let's save that again. And for right now, we can just remove, by typing in rm, we can remove the files we created, the new file.txt, and also another test.txt, so they are no longer there. And if I type in ls, we can display a list of all the files. So these are also the previous exercises, but we can see that we only have the test.txt file in here, the new file.txt and another test.txt. Both have been removed, so they're no longer available. And now we can run our code one more time. And let's first of all create a new file called newfile.txt. Let's press enter. It still tells us how large our file is. We probably don't really need that, but it can be some helpful information. And now we should actually have created the new text file here. So let's type cat newfile.txt. And again, we get the same output. So we just removed a bunch of code here and it's still working as before. So let's take a look at the next exercise. See how short you can make the script. I could make this one line long. All right, so we can make this shorter. Actually, there's a comment in here too that we can do these two commands in one line. And what we basically do here is we open the from file and we store it in the infile object here. And then we call infile.read on it. So what we could just do is, instead of doing that in two lines, we could just remove that in data here, and we use it in a bunch of other places. So we need to replace that. But for now, we can just remove this and then call .read on it. And instead of using in data here, we can just put infile to it. And let me just remove the last line. I don't think we need it anymore. Let's save that and it should still work as before. First of all, we can remove the new file here. And then we run the command. There's no error, so it should have actually worked. Yeah, and we created a new text file and it works as before. So let's try to make it as short as possible. And the author here says he can do that in just one line. So to actually do that in a single line, what we can do, and it's really bad style, but we could still do that, we can basically have several commands separated by a semicolon, and then we can basically fit that in a single line. And again, we typically would never do that, but yeah, to fit it in a single line, that is one option. Typically we want multiple lines and have it more readable, but again, we could still do this here. So let's just put all of that in one line. And technically speaking, we probably don't need the information here about printing out how long the file is. So let's remove that as well. And again, we just separate everything with a semicolon. All right, and that should be it. So if we save this now and we go back and we just remove the new file here, we can execute our code file again. And now, since we removed the print statement, nothing is printed out, but still we should be able to see the newly created text file. And there it is. So that's one way how we can fit everything in a single line using a semicolon at the end. But again, typically we would never do that. We would rather have multiple lines and have it clear and readable, but it's still possible. All right, the next study drill is we should notice that at the end of what you should see, I use something called cat. It's an old command that concatenates files together, but mostly it's just an easy way to print out the file to the screen. Type mancat to read more about it. All right, so let's go back to the terminal and type out man for manual and then cat for the command we are taking a look at. And it's going to open the man pages, the manual pages, and here we can find a description. So the cat utility reads files sequentially, writing them in the standard output. The file operands are processed in command line order. Cat reads from standard output. Alright, so that's basically how we can use it. So it takes a bunch of different parameters we can work with. And if we, for example, enter the command cat followed by the file name, then that will print out the contents of the file to the standard output, which is the terminal in our case. And we could, for example, also use it to print out the contents of multiple files. And we can do some more fancy operations here. But the basic case that we used here is just to use cat followed by the name of the text file, the name of the file, and that's a very handy way just to quickly print out the content of the file directly from the terminal. Alright, so the second to last study drill here is to find out why we had to write out file close in the code. And if we take a look at the original code here, we have out file close here. And the reason for that is that in general we always have to close the files that we open. So we can see that we in the original code had two separate files that we opened. We had in file, and we opened that from the from file that we passed to it, which was test.txt. And of course we are closing that here at the end. And then we also had out file, which again we opened again in write mode, and since we open the file we afterwards have to close it to basically give back the memory, so that's always important. So we always, when we open a file, we always need to make sure that we close it at the end. And then finally, the last study drill here, go read up on Python's import statement and start Python 3.6, so the REPL, to try it out. Try importing some things and see if you can get it right. It's alright if you do not. Alright, so if we switch over here to the Python documentation, then we can learn a little bit more about the import system. So in Python, we actually have code that's separated in different modules, like we saw before, the sys module, for example, or the OAuth module, and that allows us to import additional functionalities which are not directly part of the core Python capabilities. So that keeps our Python programs rather small, or Python itself rather small, and we still can import the required information, the required capabilities if we want to use them. So that's how we can use the import statement. So if we now head over to the command line, of course we could also theoretically use PyDoc to read that directly from the terminal. And again, here we can find some additional information. We can scroll through it and we can learn some more details about it. But let's right now start the REPL here by typing out Python 3.6, for instance. So that's a Python idle environment, and here we can of course directly execute some code. And now what we want to do is we want to import a module. So for example, we could say import sys, and we imported, well, actually let's write import argv, and we have to say for sys import argv, and then we basically imported the argv command from the system module. And then we could of course execute some code and work with argv. So for example, if we take a look at our code file here from before, we could, for example, use these variables here, and then we can use argv in our code. Alright, so that's just one example of how we can use the import command to import some modules. Alright, and that's the last study drill. Let's take a look at some common student questions. Why is the W in quotes? Which is again up here. And that's of course since we need to actually open the file and we want to write to it. So this is a string that we pass to it. You have been using strings for a while now. Make sure you know what a string is. Alright. No way you can make this on one line. That semicolon depends semicolon on how you define one line of code. So that's what we saw before, that if we want to really fit everything in one line of code, we can actually separate that by semicolons, and that would be one way to solve that. Is it normal to feel like this exercise was really hard? Yes, it's totally normal. So it takes a while to actually get used to it, and we need just to practice a lot to get to it and yeah, get more familiar with it. What does the len function do? it gets the length of the string that you pass to it and then returns it as a number. So we saw that before when we actually take another look at the code here, where we were actually taking a look at the number of bytes of the file. So here, as we passed in data to len, and then we rendered that basically using printf, we basically saw how large that text file is. So it was 21 bytes in this case, and the len function here allowed us to do that. When I try to make the script shorter, I get an error when I close the file at the end. You probably did something like this. In data is open from file.read, which means you don't need then to in file close that at the end. When you reach the end of the script, it should already be closed by Python once that one line runs. And that is what we saw before when we actually shortened those 2 lines to 1. At the end, we removed that statement in file.close. And finally, I get a syntax EOL error while scanning a string literal error. You forgot to end a string properly with a quote. Go look at that line again. All right, so we need to make sure that if we open a string, of course, if we provide some single or double quotes, we of course have to close that string again, string literal again, so that we properly start and finish the string. All right, and that's it for exercise 17. See you guys in the next video for exercise 18.